Hello, this is James Hudnall on another episode of Creator Secrets. This is episode 20, and it's about Crisis and Climax, the two major events of Act 3. Crisis is the start of Act 3. It is the turning point between Act 2 and Act 3. It is not where things get resolved, but it is where things turn for the worse or for the better, in the sense that what happens will decide the fate of the characters in the story. It's called the crisis, also known as the moment of truth, because this is where your characters decide or discover that it's do or die. That's why it's called the moment of truth, because if the hero doesn't succeed in the fight that comes next, then everything is lost for good. This is where the truth is revealed, and this is where you can use it to your maximum effect. Everything led up to this point, and this is the point of revelation, where things are about to break into the final act. Up until this point in the story, your protagonist, your hero, has been trying different ways to get what they want, and have been thwarted by the villain, aka the antagonist. And again, we can talk about villains in more detail in the villain episode I'll be doing, but the hero has been trying to get something and they've been failing, and now this is the do or die moment. Whatever they do here will decide the fate of the story. It's no turning back. The decision your character makes at this point is going to decide your story argument, whether your story argument is right or wrong. If you are trying to make a statement about something, this is where you're going to say whether this statement is true or false, because this is where it's all played out, and the resolution will result in the climax and the argument being proven or denied. So you have to think about that when you do this scene. The crisis will be a litmus test for your character, your protagonist, whether or not they are right or wrong, and you have to use all the emotional tools that I've taught you and I will be teaching you to try to make the story meaningful and make the decision meaningful, so that it reflects on all the things and the values that they've expressed in the story. That will make it a much more powerful ending as we get into the climax, which I'm about to discuss in a second. So remember what I just said before we get to the next part. The ancient Greeks used the word climax, which means ladder, because you've climbed all the rungs of the story to get to this point, which is the top. This is the top of your story, the peak, the summit. This is where you can only go down from here. And whether you go down a smooth sailing, down a smooth slope of snow, or down a rocky cliff, it's up to you. But the climax is the peak of your story. This is the point where everything decides everything. It's the battle royale, the fight to the finish. And whether it be metaphorical or physical, it's going to be a fight that will decide the story's end. And so you have to look at it from that perspective. It's also got to be the best part of your story, because the ending is always the point that people remember from a story. It's best that you use this point to wrap up the major plot points of the story in one action. So everything leads to this point. You can have a few things left over for the ending, the denouement, which I'll discuss in the next episode. But at this point, you want to wrap up everything in this action. You want this to be the definitive statement. And this is where you are going to show everything that you pretty much said in this story up to this point, thematically, and the point you're trying to make. This is where you prove it one way or the other. You either prove it or deny it. And this action should be decisive, and it should also be impressive, and it should be exciting or interesting. I mean, if your story is not an action story, if it's just a story about a bake-off or something like that, you should make it still an interesting ending to the story in some way. It doesn't have to have explosions or anything, but it should have something that makes it different. And consider that this will also be a demonstration of your character's willpower. So this is an act of decisiveness, and you should remember that. It's going to set a tone, and remember also that your audience wants a satisfying ending. They don't want to be disappointed. So you have to consider that as well. All of those things are important. If you decide to make the character lose, and if you decide to make the character fail, then you have to consider the implications of how people are going to react to that. So those are things to think about when you do the climax. This is a very important part of the story. It is the thing that people will remember, whether they like your story or not. The climax is a crossroads for your character, and what fate that awaits them at the end is determined by this scene. Also, please remember this important fact. Do not take the climax away from the hero at the end. Do not have some character swoop in and save them or take away their victory, because that is one of the worst things you can do. It's been well known for thousands of years, what they call deus ex machina. Deus ex machina is Latin for God in a box. Basically, in the ancient plays, they used to have a god show up and resolve everything, which they discovered really kind of ruined the story. So you want to avoid that similar situation by having some magical thing happen that takes care of everything out of the blue after it's never been established up to that point. That's probably the worst thing you can do as a writer. The only exception where that's worked is Raiders of the Lost Ark, where the hero is tied up, and it literally is God in a box that saves the day. But that is not the best thing to do, and it's the worst thing to do, and it only worked in that particular instance because the whole story revolved around essentially God in a box. So, anyway, I just want to add that one more thing you can think of is the final ending image. And finally, for the climax, you should consider the climax image, an image that will be seared into the brains of the people watching it or reading your story. What this should be is something that visually represents the premise, the theme of the story that you're telling. Sort of like a note that sort of signifies what you've been saying all along in one summed up image. This is something you don't have to do, but it can work very effectively if it's done right. Watch a bunch of movies and you'll see the image played out in those movies. I won't say which ones. You can find it for yourself. Some movies use it, some people don't. Some comics use it, some don't, but it's used and it's effective if it's done correctly. So that's it for now, and please check out the links below in the description, and please subscribe if you haven't done so. I will be back with another episode in a couple days, and which will be about the resolution, also known as the denouement. See you later.